Hello and welcome to this COREL AFTERSHOT Pro tutorial, and today I'm going to be discussing emphasizing your highlights. Now I'm going to be using this landscape photograph, this waterfall here, and possibly one of Mount Rainier as well, but this also applies to street photography or portrait photography or whatever. We are drawn to the highlight areas of an image, and so understanding that when you're taking the photo, but then also when you're processing it afterwards, can really enhance how much impact your photo might have on someone. So in this regard, we have a photo that is fairly flat looking. It was taken using RAW, and so it comes in with as much data as it was able to capture, and it tends to look a little bit flat, a little non-contrasty. Now, one thing, I like to do when I first get an image like this, I'll hit the W key on my keyboard, and I'll check to see what areas might be blown out. In this case, I've got the whites here are completely blown out, which means there's no detail. So the first thing I like to do, just as a check, is to bring down my highlights a bit. And you can see up here in the corner on my histogram, it's dropping, and then these areas are getting smaller here. So I'm going to bring this down a little bit more until those are basically gone, like that. And then I hit the W key on the keyboard again, and then everything goes away. So now my image this is sort of the brightest this can be before I lose detail. And now I can start kind of working to get the contrast in without losing detail, and then again, the emphasis I want. If I just come over here and crank the contrast up, you can say, wow, that's, sometimes people will do that and it'll look powerful, it'll look amazing. These greens all get punchy and then these get hidden in here, so now my attention's all drawn to this entire area here. And if you're happy with that and that's what you want, good for you. That's not what I want, however. I want to emphasize only a certain part of the image, and so I need to be a little more, I need to contemplate a little bit more about how I would go about doing that. So what I'm going to do here is actually draw an area to emphasize the light that was coming in kind of at this angle here, and then I want to highlight over here and then back up. Not the old God rays kind of idea, but the light was a little bit directional. It was coming down through the gap in the trees, but it was a little bit off to the side. So I don't want everything to be lighter. I want to have the light come across here. So if this is a little bit darker than this, that'll be okay. I want the emphasis all in this upper area. So the way that I'm going to do that is I click, if you don't have it activated, you can click your layers here. This brings up this little dialog box. I can then click adjust, and then I can use this guy here. This is the curve. What this lets me do, as opposed to using the brush tool to paint on an area, which you could do. If I were to click this, I could come over here and I could just start trying to paint in the area that I want to have highlighted, and that might work okay. That does tend to, I can actually show the stroke so you can still see it. And so, that would be a thing where I could apply into this area, whatever effect. And again, in some instances, that actually works, and I will talk about that. But what I want to do first is show you the other tool that you can use, and that's the curve here. This lets you designate an area and then a transition from that area to the outside of it to kind of give you a fairly natural look. So, and I'm sort of trying to imagine where the light's coming down, where it might be clipping, right? This is an outcropping, it might have hit that. And then I'm just going to create a few clicks. I'm not going to get too careful here for this tutorial. Don't want to make you wait around forever. And then these trees catch a little bit of light, and then the light comes back here. And so I can double click to close that off. Now, one of the things I like to do right away is I like to shrink by using my mouse wheel. And then I increase the feather. And so I hover over here and I mouse wheel the other direction. You can also come over here and just drag the feather or punch in the number. That's, however you prefer. Doing it this way, you can visually see the outline and you can determine if that's going to be good. And so again, the effect you're going to have is going to be within this area, and then it's going to transition through this area. So again, you can play with this, obviously, whichever you want to do it. Now, what I'm not going to do is just come over here and grab the exposure slider and increase exposure, because that does brighten this area up, but it's a horrible, horrible look. It's not good at all. So I'm going to undo that, Control Z, and I'm going to go to my curve here, and I'm going to make sure that I have my very brightest on the edge, and then I'm going to click here somewhere in this area so that I can create a bit of a curve. What I want to do is drag, this is the areas that are brighter in the picture, and then this is the areas that are darker in the picture. And in this case, these areas can be adjusted just where I've selected it. So it's not going to do the entire image. When I affect the highlights and the darks here, it's not going to affect down here in the lower left or in these trees in the upper corner. It's just going to be affecting in here. And the idea is to emphasize that, right? So I'm going to drag this up a bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go kind of extreme so you can see it. And what I don't want to do in this case is drag this stuff down. It's important that you don't do such an adjustment that the difference between the selected area and the non-selected area becomes super, super obvious. So I'll show you what that looks like. Let's say I were to grab this here and drag this down to make it all darker. So it darkens it all up in the selected area, but the unselected area, it just looks completely phony, obviously. So for me, I'll mess with the highlights, but I won't mess with the darks when I'm doing a selected area. Okay? So I'm going to click on my little hand here to click off, and now you can kind of get an idea of how this looks a little bit brighter. Now it may not be obvious when you're working with it because you're like, oh, you quickly adjust to what it looks like now as opposed to what it looked like before. But you can come over to your layers and you can deselect and see, oh, okay, that was a little bit like that, and now this is a bit brighter like that. And then if you followed my other video that talks about layers, you can click on the layer itself and you can play around with its opacity to create a slightly more subtle look. I'm a big fan of subtle. Whatever your style is, go for that. You do you, as they say. I'm going to go back to my main layer, go to my standard tab and click W again. Make sure that these things aren't blown out too bad. You can see just slight little knobs. I don't care too much about that, but if it's important, you can drag those down even more. Again, depends on how you're going to be viewing it. If it's just going up on Instagram, no one's going to notice. If you're going to be printing it off, maybe you care more about some of those finer details. That I leave that up to you. So now that I've adjusted this area, I'm going to hit W again, and I now want to just do some quick adjustments to the entire image to really push my viewer to look right in this upper area. So in this case, you can play with contrast, you can play with the blacks, you can add vignetting. These are all just things you can mess with to see what's going to work best for you. I'm going to add actually a little bit of negative contrast and then put in just a little bit of the blacks. Again, I keep things as subtle as possible because I don't want it to look overly manipulated and have it look like digital art. I want people to sort of have this concept that if had they been standing with me, this is what they would have seen. And then obviously using vignette, if you're not familiar, is a technique that we use digitally that old cameras would occasionally, this would happen automatically based on the lens you're using, or if you're using filters and things, the edges would get a bit darker. And the side benefit of that is that, again, it transitions from the corner into the center of the image, which creates a sort of a tunnel, a way to get some emphasis in there. And using this vignette tool, you can play with the size of it, you can play with how dark it is, and I'll give you an extreme example so you can see it. And then I make it real big. And then you can also mess with the transition to sort of from the center of it to the edge, how it transitions can be governed that way. This obviously, again, looks pretty horrible, so I'm going to back that off and then back off this. This doesn't look all that great, again, if it looks too obvious. So just for the sake of our little tutorial, we want to see the difference. I'm going to do that and a little bit of that. And so now we have an image that has a bit more emphasis on here, and let's take a look at how that looks on and off. So what I'm going to do is, because I've made adjustments to both the main layer and created an adjustment layer, I'm going to actually do a reset all and then a undo all. Basically, I'm going to undo my reset, and we'll be able to see kind of what it looks like before and after. And then we can see it. So again, this is just a quick example to show you one of the ways that you can use the curve and the curves. So sorry, I shouldn't say curve, but it's what it is. So a curve selection and then using your curves to create an emphasis that looks fairly natural as opposed to, if you remember, the exposure slider. Okay, let's take a look at another example. So here is an image I took. It's a misty morning and I was off, I can't remember where exactly, and I glanced to the side and saw the light had been coming through and was hitting these trees and making this glow a bit, and it was like a really amazing little shot. So I just swiveled around and took the shot. It wasn't something that I set up particularly. It was just I was shooting the other direction when I followed the light. That's my life advice for you if you want any. Is follow the light. And so again, raw image, so it comes out kind of flat. Now in this case, unlike the previous one, it's not that I want to just emphasize like just the tree, although I do want to do some emphasis on there. And then these were glowing a little bit too, so I want to add a little bit there and maybe even here as well. But the entire foggy area had a bit more of a glow to it. And again, if I just come here and grab the exposure, now it looks like, don't even know what I'm looking at. So what I need to do is go to the curves to make my lighter areas a little bit brighter, and then probably make my darker areas a little bit darker, but not a lot. And again, you could try to do that using contrast, and you might get a pretty good result. This isn't horrible, but I'm a big fan of going to the curves first and then doing the others if I need to after the fact. And the only reason is that you get a little bit more of a precision adjustment. Okay, so I need to make my the brightest parts much brighter, so I'm going to drag this over. I'm going to add a pivot point, and then I'm going to play with the highlight area. You can see that's moving over. And then in this case, I'm going to drag, unlike the waterfall example, I'm going to drag this down a bit to even out the histogram's range a bit more. And so now you can see that the image itself has a bit more of a depth to it. And we have mist infiltrating into the hillside, obscuring some of the trees, obscuring some of this foreground area, and then we have this tree here with a little bit of color, and then these are obviously just green in the background. So this isn't bad. It's a good start to it. Now, in this case, I'm going to make that all the way. So now I have this area here that I want to emphasize a bit. And again, maybe this area here as well. I do recall light kind of creating a nice effect on these guys here. So I can try to do a selection like we've done before. So create an adjustment layer, click on the curve, click here, and then try to create an area that I want to select to emphasize. Same thing, I can mouse wheel it down, mouse wheel the feather up, and then I can come over here into my curves, make the brighters brighter, and then I might look at that and think, that's not bad, right? This area here has been enhanced a bit, and as this area has, I can always go back and play with it some more. You can see the effect if I just go crazy. And here's the problem when dealing with the fog. So just trying to enhance the tree, because this is also in the same vein of exposure as this, it's all being enhanced. And that's not giving me the effect that I want. So in this case, what I'm going to do with my adjustment layer, I'm going to start over here, is to simply use the brush tool to paint on some masking areas that I can then use to enhance. So I'm not going to go through the entire image doing this. Again, I don't want to make you sit here and watch me. So I'm going to create an adjustment layer, and then I'm going to click in here, and I can use the mouse wheel to change its size. I like to change the intensity down quite a bit. I'm not a fan of heavy intensity. I'd rather go light here and then adjust it in the effect and then in the opacity of the layer to kind of get it the way I want it. And I can then paint on here. Now, one of the little tricks is you can hold the shift key down and zoom in with the mouse wheel. If you just try to use the mouse wheel, when you have the tool selected, it moves it. So if you want to move around, you can use the space bar to mouse wheel yourself in and out, not having to constantly click off the tool and then change size. Now, one of the other things I like to do on a regular basis is to do the show strokes here. That way I know where I've masked, but it depends on what you're doing, obviously. If it's something simple, you don't have to worry about it too much. And then I'm a big fan of changing the size as well as the intensity so that things don't look completely even over the whole area. And that way it just kind of is a bit more of a natural look, right? If it's just light painted on, it could look very much like artificial lighting or something like that, and that might not be what you're after. And I'll see if we accidentally mask an area, you can come here to the remove tool. Whenever I do remove, I just crank the intensity up, and then I can get in here and take that off of that area. Space bar. And so what I'm going to do here is, for the sake of this tutorial, is paint in a little bit more, and then I'll show you the effect. And then what I'll do is I will jump over to an image that I had done previously with the effect applied throughout, so you don't have to watch me do the whole stupid process. And so you can, once it's been masked, you can then make the adjustment, or you can make the adjustment first and you can see it happening while you're painting it on. That's up to you. But in this regard, what I've done, and again, we can do a couple of things. You can just use the curve tool, or you can use, again, you can use all the other effects on there too. So we could play with the exposure, we could do fill light, we could do contrast, vibrance, etc. So I will deselect it and then reselect it so you can see the effect it's having. And if you look at that and you think, oh, that's a bit strong, you can always go back and play with the actual adjustment that you made. You can also click on the adjustment layer and play with the opacity. So I can take this down a bit to create a slightly more subtle effect. On and off there. So you can take a look at that. So let's take a look at one that I did throughout. So here's the image I had done previously. This is actually one of my wallpapers on a computer. And so it's pretty subtle, but it has the effect applied actually throughout here and all over the place. So I'm going to do is hit the show strokes, and we can take a look at it. So you can see all of these marks are where I've applied the effect that I wanted. And so anything I might change, I can enhance the image and it'll affect it in all those areas. But you have to do this to see it. So now I'm going to show it to you there. So this was obviously, I just did this for effect. I wouldn't, to me this is overly done. I'm not a big fan of overly done. And so I can undo those changes that I made, and then the effect gets more subtle again. But again, you can play with the exposure setting. I can crank that way up. I can then come to the adjustment layer and then mitigate that by making it more transparent, until you're happy with it. So the idea is that each of these adjustments has a slightly different effect, although I found the opacity versus just changing the effect, in my eye, looks almost the same. But that's because I paint on with a low intensity. I think if I were to use the adjustment tool here and then crank the intensity up, I would end up with such a thick solid line, I would have to use the opacity to bring it back down to something, realistic. So I always like to keep this thing down, 3, 4, 5, 6, something like that. It's my style anyway. So that's using the brush tool to do a little bit of enhancement of the highlight area of this tree. Okay, here's the last example. It's a quick example using Mount Rainier at sunset or near sunset. And so counterintuitively, the first thing I'm going to do is actually reduce the exposure. I want to de-emphasize all of this, and I want this lower part of the mountain to be a little bit darker so that I can emphasize where all the light was, which was this upper part here. So in this case, I want to do a nice global, drag this down, something like this. I don't know the exact number I want to go with. I'll just pick 70. It's almost a full stop of light. And then what I want to do is emphasize the highlighted area. And so what I'm going to simply do is create an adjustment layer, and I am going to draw myself a nice little curve. And what I want to do is follow the natural spots where the light was so that I can emphasize them. I don't want to try to paint new areas that weren't light at all. And double click that guy. And what I want to do is the same effect, is to mouse wheel that down and then change the feather. Now I may decide after I apply some of this adjustment to play with the shape and the exact position of this, but see, I can click and drag this around, and then I can click and drag these around. But let's take a look at the adjustment first, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to do a slight emphasis here, and then this guy up is the main thing I want to do. I don't really want to go too bananas. And so you can see, let me click off of here. So in this case, I've got the light on and the light off. And so the idea is to create a brighter area, but with a nice natural transition to draw the attention inward. And so I can also go back to the main layer, and I can play with exposure overall. Let's say I want to do something even more dramatic, like that. Then I can go back to the adjustment and play with it. As much as you want to grab the exposure and drag it up, you're almost always going to have a bad result if I just start doing this, because these where you've got your selection mask, it's just never going to work right. So you can play with your curves to get an effect that you're happy with, right? Drag this around, get to get somewhere where you like it. I do tend to stick with just the highlights, because I don't want to really work hard at not having the effect to get too dramatic. Now in this case, I'm going to leave it a little bit more dramatic so that we can take a look at how to deal with this after the fact. Now you could delete this off, start over, or I can go and grab my adjustment points, which will highlight in red when they're ready, and then I can just drag them around. So in this case, I'm going to do a little artistic tweaking. Like that. And then, oops, yeah, in this case I didn't actually grab it in the right spot. I have to wait for it to change, and then I can grab it and drag it. And then obviously if I drag it off the image onto the canvas in the background, the effect goes all the way to the edge, which is nice. And then you can fart with the feather, and you can see that taking effect here as I go up and down the transitional area. I'm, again, a big fan of not overly dramatic. And so then I have the on and off, and you can see that I've brightened up where light, I want to emphasize the highlight where people should look, and then obviously try to get rid of where they shouldn't look. And so an image, this is more of a finished image. I spent a little more time getting it just right, trying to make the emphasis all in here where the light was hitting. Again, it's not like I have a fall colors or spring flowers in the foreground or a lake or anything, but again, this is just a good example of being able to see the effect of the highlights. So we can take a look on and off. There it is with it on. So not bad, not bad way to go when you want something, a subtle adjustment. So anyway, those are a couple different ways for you to use Corel Aftershot to emphasize your highlights, because that's where people are going to be looking. So use your tools at your disposal, the curves, exposure, contrast, use your brush tool, use your curve. That's become my new favorite, to emphasize what you want to bring across in an image, whether it's just for yourself or if you're sharing it with others. Thanks for tuning in, and please let me know in the comments below if you want to see any other tutorials, other parts of the tool, or emphasizing different techniques for editing photos. And be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get new video notifications when they are uploaded. Talk to you later.